Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, we have a very special guest, Vulcan, our very first study streamer. Join us as we talk all about study streaming, juggling multiple languages, and doing a PhD. All right, I am here with Vulcan. Vulcan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I go by Vulcan on YouTube. I'm a study streamer. Some of the time I stream language learning, but a lot of the time I also stream some of the work that I do for school. I'm currently a PhD student in robotics. I kind of do exoskeleton and prosthetic design work for my PhD. And when I can work from home, a lot of the time I stream it.
Right, and you stream on your own channel here on YouTube, and then
Mhm.
you sort of have a relationship with Refold where you post and you sometimes stream language learning as well.
Yeah, so before I started streaming, I was already integrated in the Refold community, and after I started streaming, I thought it could be a cool way to connect with, some other people in the Refold community and maybe get some community, accountability going, and I reached out to George, and he let me put my stream links in the Refold Central.
Yeah, you're the first sort of uh, unofficial partnered study streamer. You have a dedicated channel on Refold Central, and I think that's I think it's cool. Now, study streaming, do you wanna explain that for some people? So, I'm definitely not, not Gen Z. I think a lot of Gen Z people, it's really common to, like, you have study streams, maybe people, they don't wanna study alone.
Mhm.
I've seen people do it also in, like, homework Discord servers. They, like, all get on cam and study together. What is study streaming to you?
I kind of think of study streaming as a virtual library environment. So, why leave your house, for example, if it's just as efficient to study at your desk at home, or go to the gym if you have equipment at home? I think people typically go to study streams or these like homework discords in order to put themselves in a mind space to be productive and create habits around that. Uh, and if you can do that without leaving your home, then it's pretty efficient. It really got popular during COVID because you actually couldn't go to the library, so this virtual environment became more necessary, and I saw the popularity rise during that time because I think there were study streamers during that time. If you go on YouTube, there's records of that, but it really started becoming really popular during the pandemic.
Yeah, so Refold, we're all remote workers. And sometimes we do co-working sessions where we sit in a Google Meets chat and we work. We might have some idle chit chat while we're doing it. And I think study
Mhm.
streaming sort of scratches that same itch.
Yeah, I think so. At first, it's kinda with strangers, which I think is has a little bit less of accountability, but if you make a routine of going to the same stream, you eventually get to know the other people there, and then I think it's more similar to what you described.
Yeah, how is the community of like study streamers? Because the immersion learning community is kind of small. Everybody eventually
Mhm.
knows everybody, or at least knows of everybody. How is this? I imagine the study streaming community is much larger.
Yeah, I think in terms of the streamers, my channel's still pretty small, so in terms of the other study streamers, I don't personally know most of them. I know of most of the study streamers above a certain amount of subscribers just because there's not that many big study streams, but there's tons of small ones. And I'd say, like, community members, people that attend, study streams, you will see, like, since the time that you stream isn't always convenient for everyone, people do, like, hop around streams. It's at any given time, there's a stream going on. If the study stream you usually don't go to isn't available, then you can go to another one. So I do think that there's a lot of like common viewership in the community. And if I join like the Discord channel for another study streamer, I'll see some of the friends from my study stream there as well. Um, but there are a lot of people, so it's still it's still pretty big overall, I think.
Yeah. So you mentioned you have like regular viewers. What is your interaction like with your viewers? So I've watched your stream a handful of times, and I think that you study sort of in time blocks, and then you take a break where you chat with the stream. What's that like? So we first started the Refold podcast as a live event on Discord, and it could be quite difficult to keep up with having a podcast and then also interact with the viewers at the same time.
Mhm. So the way that I personally navigate that is it's very rare that I respond to the chat during the stream. I actually even have a little thing that says chat during breaks. So if people have conversations while I'm studying, I don't really read those. I wait for the breaks in order to address comments and talk to people, and it kind of syncs up our work break schedules. And how that works is there's a method called the Pomodoro method where you work for a time block and then you take a break for another time block. And different streamers do different things, and you could really break it up however you want. But some of the most common ones are like 25-5. So 25 minutes studying, 5-minute break, and you rinse and repeat. And then another one is 50-10. So 50 minutes studying, 10-minute break. My stream does 60-10. So 60 minutes studying, 10-minute break. And you'll see just about every permutation possible. But if we're not chatting during the study session, that kind of syncs us up. So we'll all work for 60 minutes and then we'll chat and relax for 10 minutes.
All right, and a 60-minute time block is pretty big. So I have ADDPI or ADHDPI, primarily inattentive. And I
Mhm,
definitely, whenever I do the Pomodoro method, I prefer
mhm,
smaller time chunks. So shorter breaks, but also shorter periods of work.
mhm. Yeah, I
So
think that oh, sorry, you continue.
how did you stumble into like 60-10 as a workflow for you? How did you find something that worked?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm gonna recommend something different than what I did, but I'd recommend just, starting with the smaller time blocks like you're saying, and then once that feels easy to get through the work block before the break, like once you start thinking, "Hey, I don't really need a break, I could keep going," then start experimenting with bigger work blocks, than you were doing before. I think all that matters is kind of like your efficiency, like what percent of the time you're spending working. So I would try and push that up, because you could have like low efficiency if you have like a 3-hour study block, but then you also have a 3-hour break block, right? So
Mhm.
I think just trying to push your efficiency up over time and as you feel comfortable is beneficial. I was in a position where I'm in a PhD program and I've kind of been on the grind for a long time. So starting out at 60-10 worked out for me. And what kind of happened is it was really hard at first and then it got easier and easier. And I don't think I'll do larger work blocks than that on stream. Sometime I prefer free flow off stream. I just take care of the things where it makes sense to do 60-10 for on stream, and stuff where I wouldn't really want to constrain myself in that way, I take that off stream.
Okay. Yeah, there's some sort of game theory where if you know that you're not going to have enough time to do something in a time block, you don't do it. And I've seen that with coaching clients at Refold, where if they work something into their immersion and it doesn't fit neatly into a time block, they're less
Mhm,
likely to want to do it.
mhm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. For me, I think it's actually more type of work. I do understand what you're saying, and I think that definitely happens to me, but I think it's more often that, like, there's certain types of work that I could do for multiple hours at a time, and then there's certain types of work that I really would only wanna do for, like, 15-minute segments, and, uh I handle that stuff off stream and just kind of like choose the tasks that are more catered to the 60-10 for my on stream work.
So, speaking of your on-screen work, what exactly do you stream? So you're balancing a PhD program in like robotics as well as being a language learner. So what exactly do you stream? How does that look?
So that depends a little bit on my research schedule. So my current schedule, most of my work has to happen in my research lab with expensive equipment that I don't have at home and
Mhm.
collaborating with lab mates. So the only streaming that most of the streaming that happens now is homework for a class I'm taking and language learning stuff. So if people stop by my stream close to the time this podcast is published, you'll probably see mainly language learning stuff. But in the time when I have a lot of research I can do from home, this is usually like paper writing or like writing code to post process data, uh, things of that nature. I'll stream that. And then also machine design. I do machine design in computer aided design softwares. Like if it's not stuff I'm trying to patent, I'll show my screen for that. Or I'll just like have it behind the camera and you'll just have to trust that I'm working basically. Uh, but that's kinda what you'll see. I try and do 2 hours of language learning a day right now because 'cause I'm kind of in a I have less time for language learning right now, so that's what I can put in, and the stream is the way I keep myself accountable for that. So, almost every day, I have a 2-hour stream that's only language learning, and I'm handling my lab stuff off stream right now.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen your schedule. You tend to make your schedule in advance and then you stick to it, which again, you're in a PhD program. That's probably the norm. But, at the language learning community at large, that's actually quite an achievement. A lot of people are not used to making schedules, outside of school or work. So at
Mhm.
school or at work, you generally have a lot of your scheduling done for you, right? Professors have office hours. You have to do certain things at certain times of the day, and that's that. So, do you feel like your PhD has helped y or doing a PhD program, do you feel like that it's helped regiment your studying for things like language learning?
Maybe. I'm not exactly sure. I almost feel like the stream helped me regiment, that actually, because before the stream, I would kind of have to build up enough motivation, willpower, or cultivate a habit in order to start doing my language learning. But I can almost like peer pressure myself by making a schedule, clicking a button, and then I only have to use like willpower and motivation for a second. And once it's published, I do my best not to cancel. It does happen sometimes, but I do my best not to cancel. So once it's published, I've kind of peer pressured myself, positive peer pressure into you are going to be doing language learning during this time. Um, because I did struggle with that a lot, despite being in a PhD program, because I would finish a ton of work for the day and I would be exhausted. So I think it almost worked to my detriment that I would be exhausted at the end of a long day. And then I also wanted to do language learning stuff, but there was no like social obligations or, if my habits weren't in line, it could take a lot to get me to start working on stuff.
You mentioned positive peer pressure, and that's a great way to put it. I myself, would cancel on my friends if I knew that I could get away with it, but I can't. So if I'm invited to an event, I'll go to it even if I don't feel like it that day, if I feel a little
Mhm.
down or lethargic, because I've made that social contract to go. I've said, yeah, I'll go. So then you have to go. You're expected to. And I think that posting your schedule publicly and having a steady stream of people, viewers, friends who watch you study and study with you creates sort of a social contract where you're saying, hey, I'm going to be here and I have to do it. Because if you don't, people will not be happy.
Yeah, it's kinda similar to having a buddy at the gym. So I haven't been good about exercising the last few years, and I'm trying to get better at it, and my roommate has been going to the gym with me, and that social contract is very similar feeling to my study streams.
Yeah. So how do you balance like studying for a PhD and language learning. In addition to the language learning, I think you've got 2 languages under your belt, right? So you came into language learning doing Spanish and you crushed it. You got pretty good pretty quickly, if I understand. And then you pivoted to Japanese. And now you're doing Japanese as well as this PhD program. So how do you strike a balance there with all that going on?
Yeah, my one recommendation I have is to know what your highest priority is at all times, because if that's not clear, then it can get really frustrating because you might spend more time on language learning in a day, and then you're behind on your other obligations, and or you spend more on your other obligations, and, I guess if those are your higher priority, it's fine, but I think knowing what your highest priority is and also knowing the minimum amount you wanna spend in a day, unless it's really, like, you know, unless everything's your apartment's, like, falling apart, your building's falling down, like, a minimum amount that unless something really serious is going on, you're gonna do, and I think those 2 things help me. So, for me, research is number 1 priority, so I set a amount of time of research that I need to do, and once that's done, then language learning is my second priority, and there's a minimum amount of language learning that I wanna do each day, which is 2 hours, and I make a system to make sure that I get those 2 hours, which currently is study streaming. Sorry, I have something in my throat. Which is currently study streaming, but could be habit building, social contracts, like you mentioned, with friends that also study. It could be motivation if you have a lot of that to spare.
I
Um,
think that you're right that systems beat motivation, though. It sounds like you're big into building personal learning systems for yourself. So right now it's the study stream, but it could be other things. Um,
mhm,
I've found that motivation tends to be fleeting. We start out very motivated, and then over time we get less motivated. But if you can make it into a proper system that you do every day, like you're doing, then you tend
mhm.
to be successful. And speaking of being successful, how was it? When did you decide you were done with Spanish and you pivoted to Japanese? What's the story there?
Before getting into that, I guess there's just one thing I wanted to touch on motivation and systems. So I totally agree with you. Motivation can be fleeting, but I also think it's very powerful. So I think if you have ways that you try to motivate yourself, that could also be very powerful. And I guess that's kind of a system. But if there's like a favorite show or if there's like, something that you really want to be able to like talking to native speakers or like you can get yourself in a mind space where where your motivations increase, like, even if that means talking to an italki teacher once a month before basic fluency just to be, like, embarrassed at how hard it was to communicate and really motivate yourself. I think it's kinda good to attack it from both sides. Uh, I think I'm a very passionate person, which is why I feel that way because I think there's a high emphasis on structure when I also think motivation can be very powerful. But in terms of your other question, you were basically asking, like, why I don't spend that much time on Spanish anymore?
Yeah, so I believe you came into Refold doing Spanish, right? And
Mhm.
then you pivoted to Japanese. So, what's the story behind that? And then I have a follow-up question for that, but I'll wait for your answer.
Okay, so I started with Spanish because I'm from Austin, Texas originally, so I grew up with a lot of Spanish speakers around me. It just so happens that in my PhD program and a lot of the close friends I have also are from Latin America. So I live in the United States, which Spanish is this, there's a huge population of native and fluent Spanish speakers in the United States. So all those combined, when COVID hit and I had a little extra time, and of course I can't just have free time apparently, I decided to embark on learning Spanish. Um, I discovered Matt's channel and was trying to apply a lot of the stuff he was talking about for Japanese to Spanish. And I think just hearing Matt always talk about Japanese and, like, also having watched a decent amount of anime, especially in undergrad and high school, and being into Japanese music, I started to think it would also be cool to maybe learn some Japanese, but I felt like these feelings were unproductive because I was focusing on Spanish. So what I did is I would spend, like, 20 minutes a day learning Japanese just to kinda, like, scratch an itch, and then I would spend the other hours that I had allocated on Spanish. Um, and I think after a year and a half, I was in a position where I could watch, most of the stuff that I wanted to watch on Netflix, no problem without subtitles. I actually never really use subtitles. I know that's not like Refold-esque, but I like to just watch raw from the beginning. Um, but I was able to eventually watch raw and actually understand and follow the story no problem for like whatever show I wanted. So Spanish became a media consumption device instead of a learning pursuit at that point, almost. It's like I have an excuse to watch Netflix because it's, like, technically productive, uh, and once it was that, enjoyable to watch Spanish, I think my motivation to continue improving dropped a little bit, um and I was just starting to reach the point in Japanese where I was starting to realize how different learning Japanese was from learning Spanish in a way that I liked a lot. One of the ways is how concepts are created. So there's not really you can't really translate between English and from English and Spanish to Japanese and back. It's very clunky. Concepts are just cut up way differently. So the idea of almost building a new system for dividing up reality just seemed super cool to me, and it became kind of a intellectual pursuit, I guess. I just thought it was developing my brain in a way and I really enjoyed, and I think Spanish did a lot of the same, but to a much lesser degree because you can get away like, if you translate from English to Spanish, you're way closer to what it actually means than from English to Japanese where you're, like, wrong or, like, very far from the truth most of the time.
Mhm.
So I kinda became addicted to that. I became addicted to, like I started my, like, soft monolingual transition almost immediately as soon as I could, where I would, like if I could understand the Japanese definition, I would throw that in. I would, DeepL or now ChatGPT, Japanese to Japanese monolingual translations and put those as my English definitions. Um, and I just enjoyed removing myself from English with Japanese because I learned Spanish, not through a monolingual dictionary, I learned it with English, and, so I guess I just have been approaching Japanese very differently in a way that I enjoy, and I thought that I could continue to use my Spanish as a media consumption device so that it doesn't atrophy, so I switched to Japanese.
So right now you do most of your media consumption in Spanish when you want something fun to do.
Yes, so if, watching Japanese is too much of a chore and I kinda wanna relax, I'll put on something in Spanish.
And you mentioned that you did not use subtitles. So the concept of intensive immersion usually involves like sentence mining and doing
Mhm.
lookups. So how did you go about that with Spanish if you didn't use, excuse me, if you didn't use subtitles?
My process for learning Spanish was actually super, like, not great, I feel like. I wouldn't recommend it necessarily. But I'll say what I did. Just I was still figuring out language learning, but what I did is I downloaded a 5,000 word Anki deck, and it had one English word for every Spanish word. No audio, no nothing. Like
That sounds like
this,
the famous dictionary of frequency dictionary of Spanish.
yeah. So this is like not what I recommend, but I just blasted through those 5,000 words in like 2 months. and then I threw the Anki deck away, like, it's deleted, it doesn't exist on my Anki anymore, and then I went raw after that and with no lookups and went to fluency like that. No grammar study either.
All right. That is a very interesting method. Um, and I think I've heard a lot of successful language learners do that. The refold method is one way, and I think it's meant to be gentle. Your average Joe can do it. Ben at Refold. His mother is refolding Spanish, right? And it's
Mhm.
gentle, do 1,000 words, start doing lookups. But I think there's something to be said for sort of binging your first couple thousand words and then going raw. It seems to have worked out for you.
Yeah, I don't think I can do that with Japanese, though. It's, like, not as sticky.
Mhm.
In Spanish, the words are super sticky, they almost feel like English words.
They do.
Um, so I was able to do that, and, obviously, the second I deleted that Anki deck, like, tons of the words started to fall out of the leaking bucket, but at that point, my time was no Anki and, like, tons of immersion, so it ended up working out, and I have forgotten all of those associations since they weren't reinforced for longer than a couple months. I think some of the associations might still be there, but I can't tell if it's like that Anki deck or if it's like the fact that English and Spanish actually are very similar in a lot of ways. Um, but I'm doing a very different method with Japanese because I just feel like it's a little different because things aren't as sticky and there's so many kanji that you need to learn just to read.
Yeah. Do you
Um,
want to elaborate on how your methodology differed from Spanish to what you're doing now for Japanese?
yeah, so for Japanese, I didn't do a binge. I do 10 words a day. Um, I did try and do more, but I never could, sustain it just because 'cause they're not as sticky in my mind. Um, and I did use a pre-made deck for a little bit, like maybe 1,000 words, and then I started mining from my immersion after that, and I think the way it's different is Anki's like a core part of my language learning process for Japanese, um, which it wasn't for Spanish, and then I didn't mind for Spanish, so that's also that's integrated into Anki. But also, since things are way more slippery, there's certain things that I need to. I'm more strategic with how I spend my passive immersion time since I value it a lot. Since it's really easy to forget things, and I don't have as much time learning Japanese as I did when I was learning Spanish. So, like one thing that I do is if there's a TV show that I like, a voice actor that I like, and a character that I like, and all those align. At the beginning, I did intensive mining of every word that I didn't know from that show that that person said, so that if I was busy and needed to, hear my Anki words again, I could just passively listen to that show, and tons of my Anki cards were from that show, so I would hear almost all my sentences in a very condensed way. So that's how I did it at the beginning. And also since I liked the show, liked the character, and liked the way their voice sounded, Anki was very enjoyable and, uh, sustainable, I think. Uh, I also focus on accent more with Japanese, like, I have been focusing on pitch accent since the beginning, so, um, I don't grade my cards based on pitch accent, but I think of where, uh, the pitch drops for every card that I do. I, like, have vocab level audio, and I play it and I have the sentence level audio too. Um, and then grammar is part of it as well. It's like almost the opposite of what I did for Spanish. I went through Take Him's guide. I use ChatGPT as my grammar guide now and kind of as my monolingual dictionary a lot of the time as well. Um, but I still do the raw listening only for Japanese. I don't do subtitles mainly
So,
because
where
I
do you
just
get
don't
your
enjoy.
interactive immersion from? So where are you doing lookups and how are you mining if you're not using subtitles?
Yeah, so I have focused mining time where I'm literally just pulling words from the show. So if I recently started using the ASB player, I think is what it's called, instead of
Mhm.
Migaku for a couple of reasons. But with Migaku, I could just scroll through the subtitles, see where the red was for words I didn't know, click it, it goes into my Anki, and I would just do that. And then I would go back, look at those sentences, and turn them into cards. And these are shows I've already watched raw, so I don't need to consume them to know the context and like stuff like that.
Interesting. That's actually the reverse of what we usually see with clients, where our usual recommendation is to go through something intensively first, and then if you would like, go back through it raw after having done the lookups. So it's interesting how, and I think that's great. I think that more people need to experiment with in immersion learning and input based learning. One of the first rules of Refold is it's a method, not a dogma. And I think
Mhm.
if you found a workflow that works for you, even if it's different from the so-called standard, I think it's fine.
I mainly do it for enjoyment, not because I think it's, like, better or worse.
Mhm.
I just don't like pausing and looking it up, and the whole reason I'm learning Japanese, like, part of the reason is so I don't have to watch anime with subtitles, so continuing to watch anime with subtitles, would frustrate me a little bit. Uh, and if it's a slice of life show, I can follow the story, so, it's not too bad.
Yeah. People worry about having the most efficient method and this, that, and the other. And at the end of the day, the best method is the one that you do, the one that you do daily that will take
Mhm.
you to fluency.
Yeah, 100%. Definitely, especially if you have Refold to guide you, because I think before if you're not in the Refold community, you could actually, I think, do certain things that would make it inefficient enough where you might quit and or it would take such a long time that it would just be, like, kinda painful. Um, but if you have Refold to guide you and you're, like, sort of under the umbrella, I think as long as you're consistent, you're probably good.
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a client come to us who had a multi-year long Duolingo streak and um, was not anywhere near where you would think he would be after several years of study.
Yeah. Duolingo has just, like, gamified language learning, so I think it's very common to see people with really large streaks, and, it hurts me a little bit when I see that, um, but I don't say anything just because, like, I'm not trying to, you know I'm not on, like, a quest to convert people to Refold, and that sounds like a painful conversation to have every time I hear someone talk about Duolingo, but, um, it does, like, frustrate me a little bit because I think the people at Duolingo must know that it's not a long-term solution. It's like I think it's a good way to get people in the door because it's really exciting and it's fun and it
Pop
can teach you
culture.
things. Yeah.
Everybody has done Duolingo at some point. So if you talk
Mhm.
about it, people understand. If you talk about refold, the first thing is, what did you say? Retold? Recold? They don't even hear refold and understand what it means. So um, I learned this trick from Ethan when I explain refold. I make a motion with my hands so they understand what refold is. But actually explaining, "Hey, we watch anime for hours a day and we get good at a language." It's just people have a hard time accepting that, even when you do sort of explain it to people who are learning their first language.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see why like, it's interesting to think about how that's the case because, everyone learns their first language in a way that's more similar to Refold than to Duolingo or the classroom or any of that. Uh, yet with this is it's kind of how the world works for language learning. So people's intuition is formed by their environment, and it can be really hard to shake preconceived notions.
And you see this a lot with particularly people from European countries. They do start English very early. in school.
Mhm.
And they might have watched thousands and thousands of hours of YouTube over the years in English. If you grew up in Sweden, you don't have that much content in Swedish. You drift towards English.
Mhm.
But sometimes you can talk to these people from like Western Europe and say, "How did you get good at English?" They're like, "Oh, I learned it in school." And they totally ignore that there are not video games available in Dutch or Swedish and that they had to immerse and they had to put in the time. Um, so even people who do their second language sort of in an organic, uh, sort of input heavy way may still misattribute why they got good at their language to school.
Yeah, since it's such a black box process, I think it's super easy to do that. Um, and part of the thing that excites me about learning a language as a fully fledged adult is just how conscious I get to be of the process, which is something that, bilingual or multilingual people that learned languages from really early age don't have. Uh, so sometimes it's kind of frustrating to be like, if I started this when I was a kid, I would be fluent in multiple languages. But the one of the pieces that I really like is the piece that you would lose if you were to learn it as a child.
I have a sense of envy sometimes that I was a disorganized teenager because I had a lot of time as a
Mhm.
teenager that I don't have now. And when I do have
Yeah.
time now after working a 45 hour week,
Mhm.
um, plus other things, taking care of business around the house, doing errands, I do not want to study as much. And I
Mhm.
sometimes have this envy when I see people like Matt who they did it, right? They started young enough. They were not, they're at that sweet spot where they are conscious of what they're doing, but they still have that time, that youthful amount of time and energy uh, to invest in language learning. And I imagine being in a PhD and then also other hobbies and other interests really eats into your time. And do you ever have any sort of envy? Like, if I were Matt, if I were, starting this at 16 or 17, it would be different.
Yeah, sometimes I think about things like that, but for the reason I mentioned earlier, I do still value learning it at an older age. Also, I think Matt, it's like an extreme comparison because most, it's hard to be hard on yourself. Like most people aren't that dedicated to something at
Especially
such a young
teenagers.
age.
I know that
Yeah.
when I was Matt's age, Matt's age, I know that when I was a teenager, I was very interested in playing League of Legends, hanging out with friends, uh,
Mhm.
versus something like, and I like languages. I actually started languages at the same time, but I did not have that drive, and I didn't have good guidance, I think.
Yeah. Another thing to think about, which I think Matt might agree with this. I don't want to speak for him, but uh, being that dedicated to something has costs associated with it as well. If he's spending all of his time on Japanese, then there's other things that he wasn't doing when he was a kid. And there's I don't think one is better than the other, but I just think it's like a complicated situation that's I think easy to envy on the surface, but also easy to not envy if you, like, just think about it a little bit,
Mm.
because
Missed opportunities.
missed opportunities. As an adult, you also, you know, you get to use Matt's method, the, like, whole Refold method at its more mature state, so you can be more efficient about it, even though you have less time, and more conscious of the process. There might be you might even be, like, a slightly different person today because if you were bilingual in college and hung out with people that spoke your target language instead of whoever you hung out in college if you went to college or whoever you hung out with after high school, that can really shape who you are. And if you like who you are, uh, like, then I think it's hard to regret things that could really stir up your life from its base, even
Yeah,
if they were bad. I feel like even when I face hardships, uh, if I undid some of the hardships from high school in college, I would be like a different person now, so it's hard to even wish that they didn't happen even though objectively they're like bad things.
Yeah, I totally understand. The hardships change you, and if you undo those hardships, then you would not be who you are today. I can agree with that. Now, taking a step back, you mentioned that language learning is sort of a black box, right? Like you don't really know what goes on inside. It's an unconscious process. How does language learning compare to all of the skill building that you've done in, say, your university programs? Sort of where the direct teaching is more expected and you learn things incrementally. How does that differ?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in a class environment, it's very different, but I think in a research environment, it's actually a little more similar. So I'd say I'd say some commonalities between the 2 are that you need to, spend time on it. You need whether that's active study or non-active study, you need to kind of integrate knowledge over time, and things are gonna be blurry in the beginning, and they'll clear up as you, like, work on things, incrementally. I think that and ultimately, even normal learning is kind of a black box. It just kinda hits a little different because it's not a language that you're trying to understand. It's like some concept that you're trying to understand, which is a little bit more defined than like an entire language. But language learning is a lot less understood of a process, I think, than learning calculus. So there's definitely a lot of wading through the swamp and trying to like figure out what to do and how to do it. But research is very similar to that. Like there's no one teaches you. I think you are guided on how to be a good researcher, but ultimately you're kind of still in the swamp because you're trying to learn something that no one has learned before. You need to bring yourself to the edge of what's known and then take one step into the abyss. And you can have people that can help get you to the edge and guide you on what that first step's going to look like. But ultimately, it's you that makes that first step. And uh, I think that's a lot more similar to language learning because you can't perceive your accent before you have a developed accent. You can't like know what the best method is until you actually get really good, right? Like what you think is the best method now might not be the best method when you're way better at the language and have a fresher perspective and more integrated knowledge. So I think research and language learning are very similar in that way where like you kind of wade through a swamp and take very unknown steps because no one can it's hard to guide someone through something like that, uh, with the resources that are available in language learning especially. Refold is changing that a lot, which I like, but classrooms are definitely more regimented. You can trust in the curriculum and the process and your past experience in similar environments for your whole entire life almost, just going through the school system. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question fully. I kinda went on a tangent and lost,
It was a great
uh
tangent. Uh,
okay.
Yeah, it was a great tangent. So they're similar in ways, and they're different in different ways. My takeaway from that tangent was doing what you do, being a researcher, doing your PhD. It's regimented in some ways, and you have that familiarity of having done it before, done school, been in a classroom. We also touched on this very early on in the podcast, where we talked about how school and work sort of are a system in that they have certain set hours that you do certain things, lab hours, office hours, and that removes sort of some of the need for being able to, we'll say, executive function, deciding when to do things and how to do them, and sort of waiting through on your own can be quite difficult. But you do it to some degree as a researcher, but it's a little bit different from language learning where it's like you're just kind of thrown out there.
Yeah, I'd also say it's a little different in the sense that language learning is so interconnected unless you go to a very specific domain. So for engineering, I don't think Anki is that valuable. Like, I don't need to know everything I've learned in engineering at every instance. I just need to know the web of things surrounding the problem I'm trying to solve at that moment. And if I spend time maintaining a bunch of knowledge that I'm not going to actively use for years, it's kind of a waste of time, I think, especially the cost of making the Anki cards. Whereas for language learning, as long as you're not learning super obscure vocab, you're learning a part of an integrated system that if you contact that type of learning through like immersion or books or whatever, that knowledge is going to be reinforced. And I think if you had a very narrow view in engineering, maybe you could get the same thing, but with like the breadth that you're expected to know as a PhD, it just wouldn't make sense to learn a language, to learn to be a good engineer with Anki. Um, yeah, that's another side of it, I guess.
Right. So there's less interconnection between different, I guess, arms of engineering and different things that you do. So there's not that built-in reinforcement.
Yeah, I think language learning is more fuzzy, but well contained, whereas engineering is almost the opposite in my mind. It's like I can see it clearly, but it's really unbounded. Um, and I think language learning can become like that too, but like you'd have to learn like super obscure vocab in Anki or like spend time on like things that you probably wouldn't need most of the time in order to be learning things that aren't well contained. Like the language that people use and the grammar that people use in just normal speech has bounds because you wouldn't, if you're a good communicator, you wouldn't use words that the other person isn't going to understand. So you, even if you know tons of vocabulary, you kind of put filters on your output in order to increase the comprehension of the other person so that you're communicating properly. So I think you see this more so in spoken language, but also to some degree in written medias as well.
For sure. Uh, a good example would be like legalese, where things are very narrowly defined and they're defined in unique ways, or older forms of language.
Mhm.
A good example is the house is building in modern English sounds like the house is building something. It sounds like the house is the doer. But in Shakespearean English, the house is building was how they would say the house is being built.
Mm.
And, you wouldn't want to use Shakespearean English when talking to a modern person, right? There's a difference in, and that's an extreme example, but I guess academic writing is a good example as well. When you're writing papers, you use a certain form of language that's different than what you're using, like right now, talking to me.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely a place for, uh, different types of language. It might be because I'm really early in the language learning process, but, uh, I just view language is like a more contained system than engineering, but maybe it's just because I've spent way more time on engineering, you know? Uh, I feel like things get integrated really well because I think your brain kind of stores language in a different way than it does other things. Uh, and the web interconnectedness is way stronger, at least subjectively to me. Uh, whereas like if I'm designing like physical if I'm designing like a beam, that's not really reinforcing my ability to design like uh to do like fluid dynamics on paper. Like those are like so separate that there's basically no benefit. But I feel like when you interact with language, it kind of scratches a system. It's like I'm interacting with Japanese, my brain knows all this other Japanese and it's reinforcing my motivation to hang on to that knowledge almost. There's no way to confirm this. It's just like subjective experience. But I think if you contacted your foreign language, some of the things that you're not contacting are still being reinforced just by the fact that your brain is prioritizing this like language model that it's building. Uh,
It would be interesting to see a comparison of different corpora, different bodies of English, comparing spoken and like academic English, and actually seeing how much of an overlap there is. Because I bet you're right. I bet that if you look at it, even the most uh, stilted formal English we can imagine probably has a lot of the same bits and bobs as conversational English. And it would be interesting to see sort of, if we could compare grammatical structures, and we can, uh, grammatical structures, vocab, things like that. And I'm sure there are probably studies doing this from academic linguists. But I'm curious now. You've sort of piqued my interest. I imagine there's quite a lot of overlap.
yeah, I mean, I think the fact that we don't talk about like I'm learning the Japanese fluid dynamics this day and then Japanese physics the other day kind of just shows a little bit of how unnecessary dividing it up too much is. Like, I don't reinforce my knowledge of fluid dynamics by designing a prosthetic, uh, unless it has, hydraulics in it, I guess. But uh, in Japanese, I think you feed the system by contacting the system. So I can't know these things. I'm just kind of describing my subjective experience, but it feels different brushing up on my Japanese than it does brushing up on the engineering knowledge. It feels like it's stored in a slightly different way. It's a little bit different of the activity. There are parallels that can be drawn because they're both in my brain, but definitely a lot of differences that be appreciated.
For sure. Now, taking it back, we are almost at time, but before we go, I did have a couple of questions for you relating to advice. So, what is some advice you would give to somebody who wanted to do what you do in terms of anything, language learning, study streaming, um, being a PhD student?
I think for language learning, I'd recommend uh, the Refold site. I also think the Q&As that Matt gives are super valuable just to see how people think about these concepts in a way that's not just reading the website. So I really like that y'all are publishing the Q&As because those were um, I found those very valuable along my journey. I'd say a huge thing for language learning that I recommend is never to assume that you know what the right method is, especially at the beginning, because you can't really see what's efficient until you're kind of like moved along. Like your definition of efficient is going to change as you get better as a language learner. And if you waste too much time on methodology and trying to make everything perfect, you're just investing in something that's going to be broken like a couple months later anyway. So I would take the advice of Matt and Refold and uh, go with that, and then evolve it as you see fit and not obsess about it. For study streaming, George and I talked about this a little bit before the podcast, but I recommend trying not to let like things that people say in the chat bother you. That's really hard to say. That's really hard to actually do in practice, but people are going to say things you don't like every once in a while. Luckily, my community is like 99.99% positive, so it's very rare, but that 0.01% can really bother your mental health, especially if they get your pressure points. So I'd say just be prepared for that and also view it as a growing opportunity. You can become immune to those comments in a way that increases your self confidence and kind of wears away at your insecurities. But just to be careful, if you're feeling overwhelmed, just don't study stream the next day. Like it's very possible if you don't overcome insecurities and people keep pushing your pressure points that you'll be worse off than you started. So don't push yourself too hard, but I think there's growing opportunities there. Um, And if you want to do a PhD, just make sure you're really passionate about it because it's a long time. At least for my field, it's 5 years. And I did it because I was passionate about it, not because I wanted to be called doctor or anything like that.
All right, and Vulcan, thank you so much for being here this week. And it was a different sort of podcast. I feel like I'm walking away having learned a lot. So, thank you so much for the exchange of information. And everybody else, I'll see you guys next week.
Great. Thanks for having me on, George.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.